that China will continue to move in the direction that I hope it will, in the direction of the rule of law, in the direction of representative government, and away from the one-party state with all the abuses that come with that. But it is far from certain. Right now, the reality is that, unlike in the Cold War, the ideological antagonist is going to win the economic race. The Soviet Union failed to do that. At no point did it come close to overtaking the United States, despite all the bluster of Khrushchev. The IMF has China overtaking the US in terms of GDP in 2016. And in some ways, that understates the scale of the Chinese challenge. The Chinese challenge in the realm of cyberspace is very real. And if your corporation hasn't experienced it, then you are either lucky or oblivious. That's a challenge, a strategic challenge in what might be called the new frontier of strategy that I take very seriously indeed. And so, by the way, do the leading military thinkers and strategists of the United States. So no, I don't think we can simply say, whatever, it's fine. It's not fine. It's not fine that leadership is passing to a society that is not based on individual freedom. That is not fine. And anybody who thinks it's all going to be okay doesn't really understand the historical process. Transitions in the balance of power are seldom peaceful. And that's another important point I try to make in the book. We need to be very acutely aware of the dangers that lie ahead as this moment arrives when the US, for the first time since the 1880s, ceases to be the dominant economy in the world. I hope I've answered your question, sir.
We just have a follow-up question here, and then we'll go back to the audience. So you speak about the success of the 300 million Chinese middle class. How do you think the Chinese government will extend this opportunity to the other 1 billion of their citizens?
Well, it's not yet 300 million. I mean, it's probably not even 100 million. But by 2020, most people reckon that there'll be a middle class of some 200 million. But that will still leave an enormous number of Chinese people living in what we would consider abject poverty. As is well known, capitalism, when it's unleashed, generates inequality. You don't have to be a Marxist to believe that. China's Gini coefficient, it's, as a measure of inequality, that's quite a good one. It's probably getting close to the US now. It's not as bad as, say, Brazil, but it's certainly a much more unequal society than it was in the time of Mao. Do the Chinese have a plan for their poor? Well, they have a better plan for their poor than, say, the Indians. What's really striking if you look at China's developmental trajectory is that many, many more people are being lifted out of that super poor sub-Saharan African poverty in China than in any other comparable country. The middle class is going to be way larger than the Indian middle class. If you simply look at people with incomes above 10,000 up to 100,000, it's a much, much larger number. So I think that the Chinese could credibly claim that they are moving in the right direction. But what they have to do is to continue to take people out of basic agriculture and move them into cities. That's the plan, and that's what they're doing. And that the speed of urbanization compares with the speed of urbanization in the United States 50 to 100 years ago. So I don't think that's their problem. I mean, it's not the super poor that really the Chinese regime worries about. I recently asked a leading economist there what was his biggest worry. And I thought we would have a conversation about the real estate bubble, or possibly excess investment in infrastructure. But actually, the conversation we had was entirely about politics. And he said, I worry about how we give some kind of voice to this new articulate class that microblogs about corruption every time a train crashes. And that I think, is the real challenge that they face. And it's by no means clear. There is no clear roadmap that tells you how you get from a one-party state to something that resembles representative government.
We have a couple more questions on China and Europe. First of all, I thought I was coming to see Craig Ferguson tonight. You turned out better.
Who's Craig Ferguson?
So how will Hong Kong do in the next few years? Better than under the UK rule to 1997? There's been a lot of corruption charges recently. Will that damage Hong Kong?
Hong Kong did tremendously well under British rule. I mean, it's one of the things that's sometimes forgotten that, in fact, if you just look at per capita GDP, it did as well as Singapore in the same time frame with a very, very different economic model. And Hong Kong is one of the countries that comes out, or rather one of the cities, I should say, that comes out really well from these institutional assessments that I've been talking about. If you go back to that World Economic Forum database, Hong Kong does really, really well on almost every measure of regulation, rule of law, taxation, ease of doing business. Many of the things that Mr. Fraser was talking about earlier, Hong Kong is doing well and has been doing in some ways better. But of course there's this concern that the traffic is two-way. It's not just that Hong Kong is Hong Kongizing China. I think China's pretty much Chinifying Hong Kong, particularly in terms of politics. And the corruption is becoming an issue there, as was predictable. What's, I think, often forgotten about the way China works is that it has that susceptibility to corruption that most one-party states have, but we don't read about it to the same extent that we read about corruption in, say, India. We can read about corruption in India because they have a free press. Mm-hmm. And the free press thrives on corruption stories. Mm-hmm. We really do not see the full extent of corruption in China because we read selectively about low-level corruption when the party decides to encourage its officials by making an example of a few small fry. So I'm not sure. Hong Kong's future, it seems to me, still hangs in the balance. It ultimately depends on what happens in Beijing. If they can make the transition, as somebody was putting it to me, a Chinese academic with whom I recently discussed this in Singapore, if China can make the transition to the rule of law, not to multi-party democracy, but to the rule of law, then that will be a very healthy step in the right direction. And I think that's the model that many intellectuals and reformers in Beijing are aiming for. They know they can't leap to multi-party democracy. Most people, I think, agree on that. But they do see a way of moving towards greater security of private property and more constraint on the party at the central and local level through law. Now, I think that's the thing we need to track. That's the thing we need to follow most closely.
Is the work ethic app not just another way of saying that culture is a factor in the rise of the West? And on that note, there's a secondary question. Could you talk a bit about which cultures you see succeeding going forward in terms of work ethic?
Let me put it this way, Leah. I'm not a cultural determinist. I'm an institutional determinist. You can get the work ethic regardless of your cultural background, whether you are Jewish, Protestant, a follower of Shinto, you name it. If the institutional setup where you live gives you the right incentives. And it was a great mistake in the work of Max Weber to prioritize culture in the way that he did in the famous essay that I spent a long time discussing, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. That confused, I think, more than one generation about the nature of the relationship between culture and prosperity. And it encourages all kinds of, I think, unhelpful attitudes if you say, well, one culture is better than other cultures. It's not a great deal better than saying that one race is better than other races. And I think the empirical evidence is really clear. It's not about culture, it's about institutions. And the reason we can see that is that the work ethic has relocated in ways that Weber would never have predicted. Weber took the view, along with many people in the late 19th and early 20th century, that China was a kind of static society, sclerotic, fundamentally different from the West, because Confucianism made the Chinese conservative and hostile to innovation. But that's actually wrong. In truth, people from a Chinese cultural background now work harder by far than people from a German Protestant background like Weber. My favorite joke is the joke about Germans and South Koreans, which I told earlier today, and that's not going to stop me from telling it again. It's not a joke, it's actually a fact. The average South Korean works 1,000 hours more per year than the average German. 1,000. And that is why, when you go on vacation, the Germans are already there. And when you go, it's like, auf Wiedersehen, wir haben noch 2 Wochen, ciao.
Well, I think that the person who submitted the next question, Bill McClagan, really wants those people that are going to work and bill an extra 1,000 hours per year. Is that right, Bill? It seems to me, for those of you who don't know, he's with Blake's, a law firm, just in case my jokes aren't as good as Neil's. It seems to me that these apps evolve. What is the 7th app, or is there not one?
Alcohol. There's a suppressed 7th chapter of this book. I suppressed it myself when I realized what an incredibly dangerous thing it would be for my teenage son to read. But in this 7th chapter, I argued that the other killer app of Western civilization was that of all civilizations, it learnt how best to handle alcohol. Perhaps I shouldn't say handle, to consume alcohol. And when you think about it, this is not an entirely frivolous point. Is there any greater product of Western civilization than a bottle of 1945 Chateau Lafite? I certainly can't think of many. Other civilizations struggled with alcohol, prohibited it out of, say, the Prophet Muhammad's fear of what alcohol could do. And yet we not only tamed alcohol, but we produced an amazing myriad varieties of delicious, intoxicating beverage, of which, of course, the greatest is Scotch whiskey. And if you want to know how that app was downloaded, I can take you to some bars in Japan that will make your eyes pop out your head. So, I mean, I don't mean this entirely frivolously. I've thought a lot about whether I should have written that chapter. It would have been another opportunity to quote Churchill, who, of course, consumed more alcohol in his lifetime than all of us put together, and still won the Second World War against a teetotaler.
He's got a point.
Well, I'll have another glass of wine.
Yeah, right. Neil, I'm not sure if you know this audience well enough if you think that he drank more than the rest of us combined. But I think we have another question, actually, just over there with the mic.
Thanks, Leah. First, I'd like to thank you, Leah, for straightening out. I was, of course, Neil, when you mentioned that having lunch with a banker was a boring thing to do, I had feared that you all had lunch today with the bankers from TD. So, Leah, I really appreciate it.
I want to clarify something.
That sounded really good in my head.
I was referring to lunch with Swiss bankers.
Okay, now we have it sorted out.
Question, you characterize in your book, and again today, the 500 years as the Great Divergence. You mentioned it was about maybe it's a 20 bagger as far as a relative standard of living, which in compound terms is actually very slow. I mean, it's going to be fits and starts, but it's a very gentle separation that could be missed. And you cap it off at 1978. A lot of people are talking about the Great Divergence of the last 30 years within Western culture, between, I guess, symbolized most recently as by the Occupy Wall Street. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the divergence within Western culture. If there were some apps, maybe the people deloading certain apps within the culture. If there's anything that you can talk about, and what you think it means for Western culture going forward, that we've created a different balance between the haves and have-nots, if you will.
Occupy Harvard was one of the stranger phenomena of last year. I mean, I could understand Occupy Wall Street. I could kind of handle that. But I still don't understand